In today's topic, we will cover Azure public IPs. Okay, it's not that simple, like a simple public IP that you can use, but there are certain things, there are certain concepts that we should be aware of, some design consideration and things like that. Hence, a separate topic, a separate video for Azure public IP address. In previous video, we have seen Azure Virtual Network, right? So let's suppose this is our Azure VNet, right? And all that side range that we choose to create this particular virtual network makes your virtual network a private space. So all those IP addresses are, let's suppose this is 10.0.0.0/16, right? So this virtual network is made up of these ranges, this side range, right? So all the subnets that we create inside this virtual network is your private space or consist of private IP addresses, right? But we also need public IP addresses, right? So if you're wondering why we need public IP addresses, then you need to think from the perspective, like suppose there is a virtual machine here. Okay, this is the virtual machine. Inside this subnet, this is your subnet is your private and this is the VM. Now this is a private space. If this VM needs to talk to another VM sitting in a different subnet or maybe anywhere, then these can talk to each other, right? Because both are in a private space, they can talk to each other. That's not it, because we have to run the business. We want people to access the websites. They are, and we want these VM to talk to the internet because of obvious reasons, right? So let's suppose this is internet, and if this VM talk wants to go to any website or any link on internet, it can go to the internet, right? Now we are not considering the traffic filtering, energy and all. We are just trying to understand the concept so that we could explore the Azure public IP address, right? Now let's suppose there is somebody sitting here who wants to browse the application, something like www.pacheratalks.com. Let's suppose this is something that he wants to access. So this will land, this is supposed to be land here, but how come this laptop knows here is the website? There must be something, and that something is your public IP address. All right, so let's try to understand public IP address now. Now since we have the basic concept cleared, right? So public IP address enable internet resources to communicate with Azure resources, because this guy is sitting on the internet. Now it can talk to the Azure resources, right? You may have a bastion here, then you go to the Azure portal, which is again the public website, and then you go to the bastion, come to this VM. That's a different story. But public IP address enable internet resources to communicate with Azure resources and enable Azure resources to communicate outbound with internet and public facing Azure services. If there is no public IP, let me say, if there is no public IP address on VM, the VM can still go to the internet, but this time it will go through network address translation, which is some, you can say, some Azure dynamically assign available IP address that isn't dedicated to the resource. But if you want to control it, we need to use public IP address for those particular resources to communicate over the internet, right? Now the concept must be clear. I hope it is. All right. Now we need to see the different use cases and different resources where we can assign these public IP addresses. Okay, then we'll dig the public IP address further. For example, this is the VM, so we can assign it to the VM directly. You're not supposed to, which is not a good practice, but you can directly on the NIC. NIC. Let's suppose this is the NIC. This is the NIC, and we can assign the public IP address on the NIC on the VM, which is not a good practice. But here we're just trying to understand the concepts, not the best practice as of now. We will consider uh, design considerations later, and I told you right now. Okay, there are other resources like, let me start writing it down here maybe. Okay. There are other resources like VMSS, which is virtual machine scale sets, right? If you are following this channel, you know what it is. So we can attach public IP to the VMSS. Let's take an example where scale set hosting a customer facing e-commerce website with traffic routed through a public load balancer on those VMSs. So we can utilize service of VMSs via load balancer where we are assigning public IP address on the load balancer. So it will be like, take the same example. If somebody is accessing, let me just try to show you. Let's suppose this is our VMSs with multiple VMs running. Okay, and there is public IP right here assigned on the load balancer. We have a load balancer, and at the back end of the load balancer is the VMSs. So traffic will come to this public IP or to the load balancer. It will fall to these of the virtual machines running on the VMSs, right? Now, what kind of load balancer it must be? It must be a public load balancer because it is using public IP addresses. At the back end, it could have the VM, it could have scale set, or we can also use this public IP addresses for the, I should write the load balancer, then I should write gateways. VPN gateway. VPN gateway is what? VPN gateway is something that, let's suppose sitting here, because it's a gateway. Gateway to what? Gateway to the virtual private network. That's why VPN is virtual private network gateway. Now, gateway for whom? Gateway for your any other site, maybe on premises. Okay, let's call it on-prem. So you want to talk to these resources inside the on-premises. So what we'll do, we'll create a VPN gateway and we'll create a tunnel between these two sites. Now, how this tunnel, because there is another device, some router is sitting here, which has the info. We will feed the information of this gateway to this router and router's information in this gateway. Now, how come they know we have to go here and we have to go there? Because of public IP. So you can assign there is always a public IP on virtual private network gateway or on this router side as well. But we're talking about Azure public IP, so VPN gateway is one of the resource. Similarly, if you want to control the outgoing internet traffic, you can use a device called NAT gateway. Okay, NAT gateway. This NAT gateway will also have a public IP address, a dedicated one, so that and after those routing and everything, these VM will always go through this NAT gateway to the internet. Okay, to the internet. So You can use public IP for the net gateway as well. This is only for the outbound. Now we do have something called application gateways, wherever, just like this one, the traffic will land to the public IP address which is associated with the application gateway, and it will direct the traffic to the backend resources, maybe VMs, maybe app services. Same goes like Azure firewall. If somebody is going, there is a traffic coming from outside from the internet, it will land on the Azure firewall. And how? Because of the public IP, right? So Azure firewall. So now the basic premises is clear. Anything coming from outside and you want to control, you want to give them the direction. So public IP is the direction. Public IP is not the direction, the destination. DNS is the direction to land to the public IP, right? But public IP will is actually the point from where the internet traffic will come in, and public IP will be the dedicated point from where the outbound will go if you assign dedicatedly to the resource. I hope this concept is little clear now. Now let's see uh, types of public IP addresses. All right, there is two types of public IP addresses. One is static, another one is dynamic. Now, as the name says, that's what exactly these are. Dynamic public IP address is which changes, like once you assign to the virtual machine and you shut it down, it will be removed. Once you turn it on, switch it on, then you'll get another dynamic public IP address. But it doesn't happen with the static. Static is permanently assigned to your resource. So this is the basic difference. But there is something else we also need to explore, and that is skews of public IP addresses. These are the uh, types, and now we have to see the skew. Type is nothing as big because you understand. Static is which is permanently assigned with the resource, so it will keep assigned as long as you do not unassign it. And dynamic is whenever there is a not exactly the reboot. I have not seen in the reboot, but shut down and switch on, then the IP would be changed. So dynamic is IP will be replaced, like we have the routers in our uh, home, right? So these are two types, but the most important thing is not the type, but yes, of course, use static if you don't want to change it. There is something called skews. Public IP address has two types of skews, which is standard and basic. Basic was the old one, but now as the cloud matures, they come up with standard IP addresses, which is old now as well. But the basic came the first. Now there are two different type of SKUs that you can choose for the Azure public IP addresses, standard and basic, and there are some differences. So let's start one by one. All right, now let's suppose there is a critical application uh, which require high availability. You must use standard because standard is aware of zones. It is zone redundant. So standard is zone redundant. Okay, basic is not. So in case of critical application, I always go with the standard, and of course there is some pricing difference. Now standard is by default secure. Okay, which means no traffic can go in until you apply the NSG and specifically open that particular port and protocol, which means applications needing strict security controls with explicit access rules, you must use standard. Then there are certain services, advanced services, which can only have the standard. Uh, for example, application gateway, standard application gateway, like standard load balancers. So those can only have the standard for better performance, better security. Now, your standard IP address can only be static because you don't want to change your IP addresses, right? Why you want to change your IP addresses? So the standard do not have the dynamic. Standard is always static, but in basic you have both dynamic and static. Now we talked about, because standard is giving us more features, more security, so of course it will be little expensive than the basic one. So the pricing model is more or less like, once you use this standard, you have to pay because it is reserved for you. It is static only, but for basic, you have to only pay when you use it. And there are some basic comes free as well. So basic is of course cost effective for the short-term projects, or maybe for the dev, for testing you could use the basic, but standard is always recommended for your production workloads, right? And then uh, okay, I think these differences are good enough, and let's see what is next. Now, apart from these standard and basic, static and dynamic, and the understanding why we need public IP addresses, there is something that we should also understand, which is called two things: IP, public IP address prefix, and there is something called bring your own IP. Bring your own IP was not there earlier. So your public IP, if you're migrating from on-premises to Azure, your IPs will change. But now there is a possibility where you can bring your IP addresses. You can import, but there is a particular prefix. Now, first understand the prefix. Prefix is a block of consecutive IP addresses that Azure services uh, you can reserve from the Azure services. For example, slash 29, right? XYZ dot whatever slash 29, which means you have reserved 2 into 2 into 2 is equal to 8 IP addresses. And in this public, Azure is not reserving the 5 IP addresses that we talked in the previous videos. This is public IP address. So you'll get all the 8 IP addresses for the use. So this consecutive block of IP addresses that you reserve is called IP prefix. Now, if you bringing your IP addresses from on-premises to Azure, you should have the prefix of 24. It might change or it will change, not sure, but it was slash 24. If you have that much range of IP address, you can easily get it to the Azure. All you need to do is verify your ownership and import it to the Azure. Once imported, these IPs behave just like Azure public IP addresses. So why we actually do that? To maintain the consistency with the existing IP ranges already in use by your organization, and it's useful for migrating workloads to Azure without changing IP addresses. So a lot of configuration settings will remain intact. Right now, we understood this IP prefixes, and I bring your own IP addresses as well. So this is all about Azure public IP addresses. We just try to understand what it is, because we have already understood the private IP ranges, private virtual network, but to consider architecture, design, and to be a network specialist, we should also understand public IPs, the kind, the type, why we use it, what is the right way to use it. Okay, so I hope it was helpful. Thank you for watching, and you guys have a wonderful day. Bye bye.